Hey everyone, welcome to another live video for the History Valley YouTube channel. So tonight I'm going to be discussing upcoming shows like I was discussing last night. Also, I'm going to be discussing some rescheduling that has unfortunately occurred. Okay, so we have one person watching right now. Just an audio check. Can anybody hear me? If you can, please say so in the live chat. If any of you can hear me, please tell me. Hello? The audio looks okay on my end. Okay, Victor says I can hear. Okay, good. Alright, now that's out of the way. I just didn't feel like putting on my headphones right now. That was, just, still feel like wearing it. Okay, we got one like. We got 3 viewers. If anybody has any questions, throw it in the live chat. Okay, so until I get some more questions, okay, we're at 2 likes. Okay, until I get some questions, I'm going to discuss what I need to discuss real quick. So I know I said today I was going to release at least 2 videos. The second episode to the Clementine redaction and a criticism of Jason DaCosta's Israel Only, aka Consistent Preterism. I don't think I'm going to be able to get around to that until tomorrow. Victor says, I kind of feel like Irenaeus had a hand in writing Gospels. Why do you think that, Victor? Would you like to come on the show and join me and we can talk about it? Because I know there's some people out there that believe that the entire New Testament is 2nd century. Brett says, is your theory on Saul of Tarsus and Paul being 2 different people still what you conclude? Oh, and Victor says, how so you join? I think you meant to say, how do you join? Rasta Man says, I'm more thinking Polycarp, to be honest. Okay, Victor, I'm going to put in the link into the live chat. Click on that, and then you should be able to join. So to answer your question, Brett, I no longer concluded they're 2 separate people. That was simply based on skepticism regarding Paul and Saul, the kinsmen of Agrippa, are the same person. The problem is Tertius wrote the We document. The We document, for anyone that doesn't know what that is, Acts of the Apostles is composed of 2 books. The majority of it being a third-person narrative written in the 2nd century, while small sections of it were written in first person. So it was actually someone's experience with Paul. Somebody wrote an experience about their life with Paul. And the person that wrote that was Tertius. Brett says, seems like Eusebius is the one who corrupted the NT, New Testament, that is. Eusebius didn't really mess with the New Testament. His job was to mess with Josephus and the right forged epistles. Eusebius wrote the Doctrine of Adi, like I discussed a couple days ago. Victor, the link is in the chat, by the way. Make sure you click on that. I'm going to go ahead and pin that as well. Little Impaler says, hey everyone, what's up? Rastaman, can you expand on what you mean by I'm more thinking Polycarp, to be honest? What do you mean by that statement? Victor, did you get the link? It shouldn't be difficult to join. Manbear says, seen you on Myth Vision before, just came across your channel now. Oh, that's cool. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already, please. Would appreciate it. Victor, can you hear me?
Hello? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, good. Well, welcome to the program. So, expand on your thoughts for me, why you believe that Irenaeus had a hand in writing the Gospels. Do you think he wrote 1, 2, 3, or all of them? All 4?
I don't believe he wrote all of them. My model of working in my head by reading, like everybody else is reading, we have to read Josephus, we have to read the Catholic histories. In my model, I'm more leaning towards that Marcion may have wrote Mark. They later redacted it to make Luke in the early 1st century, probably after 135 AD. And then from Mark we have the Matthew, because these are not eyewitness documents, so from Mark to Matthew. And then I believe the Gospel of John is somewhere written with the Johannine community, so that's not part of the list. But I think afterwards, because I did see a lot of hands in the cookie jar with Irenaeus and Tertullian. And from what I read from Justin Martyr, with his defense, which is after 135 AD, it's easy to see how this could have evolved later, these Gospels, rather than, because it's hard for me to believe that the Gospels were written in the early 1st century when we don't have any documents for it. All I see is Paul in the 1st century, the authentic letters of Paul and whatever he's going on, like. So, in my opinion, I think because all those Jewish rebellions that were going on, with the Kitos War, Bar Kokhba, I think that, I'm not saying like the Roman Empire did something, but when I see these apocalyptic parts in like Mark and Matthew, for me it fits more the 2nd century with the Bar Kokhba War rather than with the 70 AD war, with the destruction of the temple. Although the Gospels are alluding to the 70 AD, it's just hard for me to see without having an authentic Pauline letter post the destruction of the temple. Because then if we go into the life of Jesus, then we go into like Josephus. That's what made me into more of a mythicist, was Josephus. Like I read Josephus about the Jewish war. It totally turned me into a mythicist compared to reading the Gospels and stuff like that.
Well, what I will say is, if this is what you're saying, I do agree that the Gospels do postdate Josephus. What I've discovered is that there was a Clementine redaction of the Pauline epistles in the mid-90s. Clement came up with the idea that Jesus was a high priest of Jerusalem. And he wrote about this in 1 Clement, and he said that Jesus was a high priest in heaven. It's very similar language to the book of Hebrews. Something I will get into later is that Colossians, First Thessalonians, Hebrews, and Ephesians preach universalism, which is also preached in First Clement, which is primarily the reason why I believe Clement of Rome wrote 4 of the Pauline pseudepigraphy. Those 4 epistles I just mentioned. He also wrote First Clement. Now, Timothy, Titus, and Second Timothy are more like anti-universalists. They talk about how what they talk about is distinguishing Christianities, different factions of Christianity, rather than reconciling them, which is something I will get into more extensively on a video with a presentation and everything like that. But anyway, that puts all of those letters in the mid-90s, and what was happening is that the author of the authors of the Pauline pseudepigraphy coming up with the idea that Jesus was a high priest came from reading Josephus, because Josephus tells us about a Jesus that was a high priest.
Yeah.
Jesus ben Gamala, or Yeshua ben Gamala, in the 80s, 60s. And what the way Josephus writes about him is very similar to what's said about Jesus in Hebrews 4 and Hebrews 7. Josephus and the Talmud tells us, especially the Talmud, that this Jesus did not have Levitical blood, apparently. So his sister wife, Martha Bophus, had to pay a lot of money. I don't remember how much money it was, but a lot of money, so that her brother husband could become a high priest of Jerusalem. And the interesting thing is the Gospel of Mark has to post-date Hebrews because Mark is developing the high priestly tradition of Jesus. Because the Gospel of Mark, the Gospels have the anointment of oil. Jesus' anointment at Bethany, where oil is poured over his head, just like a high priest is anointed. When someone's anointed a high priest, they go through the same exact ceremony. So that's the thing. That means Mark added Mary and Martha of Bethany from the Boethusian sisters, Mary and Martha, from the Talmud. And that means that these sisters have been essentially anachronized from the 8060s to the 8030s. Professor Robert Eisman also compared these 2 sisters to the Bethany sisters as well, and from what I can tell, he also concluded that they are also the same ladies. Now, this actually brings me to discuss Ralph Ellis, whom I've been discussing lately. Ralph Ellis, he takes his interpretation a bit further. He doesn't understand that the New Testament is mythologizing Jesus and is developing Jesus over time. You have different authors with different opinions about how Jesus should be portrayed throughout the New Testament. Now, Ralph Ellis looks at this and he says, and instead of recognizing conglomerations, amalgamations, and deliberate conflations, he instead says, no, that Jesus parallels Jesus in that manner because that is Jesus. And I'm like, no. And then he goes further and says that Jesus started the Jewish revolt against Rome and he led it. And I asked him to show me where in Josephus that he says those things, because he always tells people on the videos and his books as well that this Jesus did start the revolt. And he keeps saying Josephus says so. And the funny thing is, he actually never quotes where Josephus allegedly said this, ever. I can't remember one time of him doing that. And what's worse is in Jewish Wars, book 4, verse 314, Josephus tells us that Jesus was executed by the Jewish zealots. And why was he executed? Because he, and alongside Ananias ben Ananias, were telling the Jews to surrender to Commander Vespasian on AD 68. And when I asked Ralph Ellis about that, because he claims that Jesus was alive and well on AD 70, and he was taken down from the cross by Josephus Flavius, whom is supposed to be Joseph of Arimathea, that would mean that Jesus strongly parallels the gospel of Jesus, if that were true, but it's not. And I asked Ellis, okay, how do you explain these chronological contradictions in your identifications? Because when you add up all the different people that he identifies as one person with Jesus, it's 24 people. About 24 people. And they all, and many of them have, well, many of them we know when many of them died, is what I'm saying. You can't die several times and be the same person. It doesn't make any sense. I'll get back to that in a second. Let me check these comments. Man Bear says that's very plausible. Clement seems to have a hand in a few letters. Midnight Charlie Man says, hi Jacob, I had literally just started watching a previous video of yours about Ananias Ben Ananias when I looked across to recommended videos and saw this was streaming live. Oh, that's cool. Brett says, executed for the murder of James 2. I suspect so. I would say yes. The Habakkuk Pesher certainly thinks so. The Habakkuk Pesher says that that the wicked priest, or the Kohen Harashi, was executed by the... Actually, I don't remember if it was Habakkuk Pesher. It might have been... It's either that or the War Scroll. One of the books of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I know that one of them says that the wicked priest was executed by the men of war for killing the teacher of righteousness, something like that.
Now, do you believe this Clement is the same as the one related to the Flavians, or do you think that's a separate person?
It's the same guy. I'm very certain it's the same guy.
Okay, because that's where I'm going in my research. I remember I looked this up last year, and I was just going over like the family tree, and it looks like it's the same guy to me. It doesn't look like it's a separate person.
Yeah, it's the earliest, from what I remember, the earliest documents that distinguished the two as separate people. Because the funny thing is, we have evidence that they were originally the same person anyway. And it wasn't until Eusebius, going back to Eusebius again, same guy that forged a whole doctrine about I, the same guy that created a king of Edessa that never existed, is also the same guy that is claiming that Pope Clement I is not Titus Flavius Clemens. So, again, Eusebius's whole mission is to confuse us on ecclesiastical history. He is confusing us about the early church, and he's writing this fake interaction between King Abgar V and Jesus that never actually took place. And the historical person that King Abgar V is based on would never be writing letters to Jesus, because the Vazus is essentially the one that becomes King Abgar V later. He was an enemy of the Jewish zealots. I mean, Josephus says so. He fled Babylon because the Jewish zealots attacked it. He fled to Babylon's where Adi-Abeni is, and he fled to Israel, where he received tax exemption in the land by Herod the Great. This happened on 4 BCE. And that's actually, when you look at Paul's letters, he's, as I've been saying for some time now, Paul is actually talking about this guy. And that's why Paul called Jesus the second Adam. The second Adam title doesn't make any sense with a Jewish rebel, but it does make sense with Bazus, because he was exiled by the Jewish army. And he was being compared to Adam in the book of Genesis, because he was exiled from the garden by God. And that's also the reason why Paul is tap dancing around the crucifixion. At one point he'll say Jesus was executed on earth, but he won't say he was crucified on earth. For some reason he maintains the crucifixion happened in heaven, then claims he's the only one that saw it with a vision. And the other thing that's interesting is, how many men did Bazus flee with when he left Adi-Abeni, Babylon? 500 cavalry. That's what Josephus tells us. Very similar to the 500 witnesses that Paul talks about in, I think it was 1 Corinthians. So we got some typological parallels with Bazus instead of a Jewish zealot. And that's why Galatians is an important letter, because if you go to Galatians, you try to figure out what's going on here. In Galatians, Paul called James the brother of the Lord. And what happens after he makes that statement? People like to argue if Paul really meant if he was a brother of Jesus or not. But people always don't read the next verse. Well, not everybody, but people don't pay attention to the next verse is what I'm saying. And what does the next verse say in Galatians 1:20? Paul says, I am not a liar. Think about that for a minute. Paul says he's defending himself against somebody that's obviously calling him a liar.
Mm-hmm.
What statement did he make? The statement he made that he was called a liar for was calling James the Lord's brother. And when I realized that's what's going on here, that there was a dispute like that, then I knew that James was offended by that comparison, by that claim that Paul had made.
Do you know what part in Galatians that's written in? So I can just read it later.
Galatians chapter 1, verses 19 to 20.
Okay.
So, the other thing that could explain this to me, because here's the thing. I am a historicist, I'm not a mythicist, but I always tell people I'm not your usual historicist. Here's how I define my position of being a historicist. The New Testament Jesus did not exist, but he's loosely based on a historical figure. But Jesus himself is not a historical figure. Now, I've been called a histomythicist by some because I put it that way. Because, in a way, my position doesn't necessarily contradict either one.
See, I agree with that position more, because when I was trying to read the New Testament, the Gospels, the early church histories, I was not finding the Jesus in the Bible that probably existed in this world. I just saw him as a combination of different people in history that was, even in the Old Testament, with different biographies of Moses, Joshua, and people like that. And other biographies of past people in the Old Testament were added to the Jesus story. They could have changed it a little bit here and there, tinkered with it, but you can see parallels to the Old Testament.
Exactly. And what's important about this is that this is the reason why I focus on Paul's epistles more than anything else in the New Testament and the first person passages in Acts. Because those are our earliest Christian texts that we've got. And those texts were not under the thought process yet of creating an amalgam literary composition of Jesus. The idea that Jesus would become a conglomeration began in the Pauline pseudepigraphy. When first Clement redacted Paul's letters, that's when Jesus started becoming a conglomeration. Then after that, we get another redaction of Paul's letters, was where we get Titus, 1st, 2nd Timothy. And then after that, we get the Gospels. And then we get the Gospels. Then at this point, it's a full-blown composite biography. And that's why I say the rest of the New Testament, except for the we document in Acts and the 7 authentic Pauline letters, are useless.
Yeah, I'm up to that conclusion because I see, when I read the histories of the church, I see a lot of people labeled as heretics may have actually written these Gospels, and we don't get a chance to see why they're labeled heretics. But every time someone's labeled a heretic, like Marcion, it's related to a Gospel. Cerinthus is related to a Gospel or the Book of Revelation, according to different factions of Christians. And what I'm seeing is, even if you look at the early church history, I don't see a Peter or Paul in Rome, like a Peter's establishing a church. The first few popes seem fictitious to me. And it seems like after the Bar Kokhba War, we have Irenaeus come in the picture. He's a new bishop. Then we have a new pope come into the picture. So I see a Christian church was somewhere in Rome, but I just don't know what they believed in, what was their gospel they were using. So that, to me, they could have been just Jewish Christians, like Gentile converted to Christianity or something, or some kind of weird version of Christianity. But I do see a lot of people being set up, like in the beginning of the, or like the by like after 135 AD, you do see a lot of church structure being set up, bishops and all that stuff like that.
Yeah. Let me look at these comments here for a second, and I'll get right back to that. What do you, Man Bear says, what do you think of the Paul Saul was really Apollonius of Tyana theory? I don't agree with that. I discussed it before in the past, I think on a Myth Vision video, but that was that had to do with Paul being semi-mythologized. More like Apollonius of Tyana being mythologized off of Paul. But that's not what I was saying at the time, though. In the long run, I ended up disagreeing with it. Brett Forsyth says Tarsus does fit the TRSV 666 model. I tend to disagree with that. I think it's Nero. Man Bear says 61666 is Nero, isn't it? Didn't think that was still contested. I agree. And Man Bear says 666. Okay. Brett says Jacob and most others do think Nero is a 666. Indeed, I do. Okay, let's get back to the topic. I'm not sure if all the Gospels are 2nd century. I am convinced that 3 of them are 2nd century. Matthew, Luke, and John. Now,
yeah.
Luke and John, I agree, post-date Marcion. At least Marcion's ministry, not necessarily his life. However, Papias needs to be considered here. Papias is the earliest testimony we have regarding to the scholarly hypothetical Quilla, or Q source, an alleged hypothetical document containing a list of sayings of Jesus that Matthew and Luke both borrow from. Papias tells us that he put together a testimony, not testimony. He said, Logia to Krios, which means sayings of the Lord. But more so, Papias wrote a later work in which he stated that he is aware of a Mark and a Matthew tradition, which scholars have interpreted it as saying that Papias is aware of 2 Gospels. This means we're looking at 2 Gospels before 110 AD. Matthew in the first 10 years of the 2nd century. And then Mark, these were written at the turn of the century, or at the earliest, 97, 98 AD, as a reaction to the Clementine redaction. Because when you look at Luke Acts, and we're going to make this point later in a future video, Acts was very concerned with the Marcionite claim, because Marcion is claiming that Paul is the founder of what would become Gnosticism. Of course, Marcion is actually the historical founder. Acts is interesting because Acts is heavily centered around this conflict between Simon Magus and Peter.
Yeah.
And Simon Magus is having an argument with Peter very similar to the argument with Paul that Paul and Cephas have in Galatians. And if you look into Clementine recognitions, I know the Dutch radicals would say that no, this is the exact same argument, and they would claim that Paul's epistles were 2nd century forgeries. All of them are. That's what they would claim. But they do claim, and they would say that the conflict between Simon Magus and Peter proves that Simon Magus actually is Paul, and they would often cite recognitions of Clement, which apparently talks about the same thing too, as well as the homilies. I don't find that argument to be too convincing, because if you look at Luke Acts, which Marcion clearly isn't aware of, Luke Acts is copying from the Gospel of the Lord. Acts is offering the Gnostics an ultimatum. It's saying, everything you believe about Paul everything you claim about Paul is actually true of Simon Magus. Which is an interesting scenario, because that resulted in Gnostics later coming to the conclusion that Simon Magus was their founder. However, the Gnostics would then modify that claim, and then they would say, well, Simon Magus was following the teachings of Paul the Apostle, which nullifies the church's attempt to sidetrack their claims for Simon Magus. All they did was make Simon Magus a follower of Paul, which was not what the church wanted. And as a reaction, they were hoping to leave Paul alone and focus on believing in Simon Magus, and that didn't work. Because the church was very concerned. That's why they were calling Marcion a heretic. Marcion coming up with the idea that Paul believed that the Old Testament God was the devil, and he said that Jesus was the son of a higher God that was sent to earth by the monad, or I think there's I'm not positive about this. There might be a tradition of Abraxas sending Jesus to earth. I'm not sure. I'm going to take a look at some of these comments. Okay. There's only one more new one. Rasta Man says, didn't they accuse Papias of being a little off and prone to make stuff up? No, that wasn't the issue. Scholars discovered that they confused Papias with another person. That Papias died in about the first quarter of the 2nd century CE, while scholars originally believed several decades ago that Papias died on 160. But it was discovered he didn't die on 160, he died much earlier than that. However, if he died in AD 160, if that dating was correct, then a much later dating of the Gospels could have been worked out. But that's not what's going on here.
Do you think that Papias was telling the truth, or could he have been his writings redacted by a later church historian like Eusebius? Like, how much of Papias is...
Papias is mentioned by Eusebius, but Eusebius isn't the only one. Irenaeus also mentions Papias, which is good because Irenaeus is a bit more honest than Eusebius is. At first, scholars were very skeptical about Irenaeus, but when the Nag Hammadi library was discovered, they found out that Irenaeus was, well, very accurate about the things he said about the Gnostics. So establishing that level of trust there, I would say he's probably correct about the things he says about Papias. Irenaeus at least didn't go around and forge anything that we know of, unlike Eusebius, who does those things. I'll get back to that in a second. There's a couple more comments. Brett Forsyth says, didn't Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark confront Simon Magus at the island kingdom stated in Acts, made SM run out of the court? I think you're talking about Cyprus. Not positive. Man Bear says, ducking out for a joint. Canada legal. Glad I found your channel, liked and subscribed. Thank you. Okay.
But could the Mark and Matthew that they had, whatever Mark and Matthew he's referring to, may not be the Mark and Matthew in the New Testament to this day? They could have just been redacting, changing things, and...
I think I remember Bart Ehrman saying something like that. Bart Ehrman did state that it's probably not our Matthew and Mark. And that's actually a problem for consensus scholarship, because consensus scholarship, I mean, whether they like it or not, they kind of depend on Papias for an earlier dating of Mark and Matthew. Although Papias also puts Mark and Matthew a bit later than the consensus wants him to either. Luke and John is just undefendable. Those two documents are definitely way later, and more authors are coming out and saying Luke, Acts, and John are deep into the 2nd century. And there's really no way around that, because Acts does not make any sense unless it was some sort of ultimatum reaction to the Marcionite claim that Paul was the founder of Gnosticism. Luke is redacting the Gospel of the Lord that Marcion's writing. And Papias is not aware of Luke. He's only barely aware of a Mark and Matthew. There are two possibilities that I currently am thinking about. either Papias is talking about the same Mark and Matthew that we know about, or they're different, but they were two gospels. Because Papias, Papias actually claims that he knew two Matthews, one written in Hebrew, one written in Greek. So, if it's not the same, then the Mark and Matthew Gospels that we've got are based on them instead, which would put the Gospels in a Marcionite priority position. There are two versions of Marcionite priority. For those that are not familiar, Marcionite priority is a suggestion that all four Gospels post-date Marcion, which is what discussed here. You could also have a second position, which is a quasi-Marcionite priority, or half Marcionite priority, which is that, okay, you got half the Gospels post-dating Marcion, you got the other half being before. Let me see here. Little Impaler says, that's a problem. We don't know who wrote the Bible and what was their names. Mark, Matthew, Luke are pen names. So is John. Yeah. And the earliest one that ascribes those pen names is Irenaeus, unless you count Papias. Irenaeus just fills in the other two, Luke and John, at the very least. Yeah.
It just seems like interesting, like, because before I was like wondering, like, there's all these documents in the whole Paul in the first century, but then you got all this Gnostic religions popping up in the second century. So I thought maybe Jesus came in the first century, like some Jews claim, like from the Talmud. But then I couldn't find that Jesus, so I abandoned that search. But it just seems like not amazing, but all these, like, if you add in all like the Gnostic Gospels and all the pseudo child Gospels of Jesus, you see all this literature just expand and explode after the during and after the second century. It seems like not like it seems pretty amazing that all this literature just pops out and that starts to get developed. That the Jesus story gets more. Now we have child history. Now we have like a different birth narratives. And now we have different gospels. Oh, he wasn't the real flesh. He got the likeness of flesh. It's pretty amazing the way how it just exploded into sects with their own version of Jesus. Like, I find that kind of fascinating.
Yeah, indeed, it is fascinating. Little Impaler says that's another problem with the Bible. A lot of sources are translations of translations in Greek. Do we even know the original language of the original sources? That's actually debated a bit, although most scholars, from what I can tell, currently believe that the entire thing was originally in Greek or Koine Greek, something like that. We do know that there are several books in the New Testament, at least a couple of them, that do use the Septuagint, which is the Gospel of Matthew and the book of Hebrews. I'm not sure if more of them do use it. I suspect more, if not all, the New Testament books use the Septuagint, because there are mistranslations in the New Testament that are identical to the mistranslations the Septuagint has. Because the Septuagint mistranslated several things from the Hebrew Old Testament into the Greek. The Septuagint is also called the LXX, for those that don't know that. So the LXX and the Septuagint are one and the same. I'll give an example. The Septuagint mistranslates the Hebrew word alma, which means young woman, into the Greek word for virgin. And the Gospel of Matthew makes the same mistake. And the Greek word for virgin is parthena. So that he translated into Parthena. And Parthena's got the word Athena in there. That's not a coincidence. And Athena is a virgin goddess. So Matthew made the same mistake. Now, several say it might have been an accident. However, I suspect it was on purpose. And the reason why I do is because you got to think about the audience that they're writing to. And you have that in mind, them using the Septuagint instead of the Hebrew Old Testament shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. And they're trying to make Jesus look like a virgin, a deity born of a virgin.
And when was this Greek Septuagint written? Because I thought the original Septuagint written in like the 230s or during the Ptolemy era of Greek of Egypt. I thought it was just the Torah, the first 5 books that was written during that first Septuagint time, rather than like the prophets and the later books.
Are you claiming a position that the original Old Testament was written during the Ptolemaic period?
Wait, wasn't that according to the Josephus? Wasn't that when the Septuagint was written?
Yeah, yes, as a translation of the Old Testament into Greek.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was carried out around 285 to 270 BCE, and that's the one that the New Testament primarily used, from what I can tell, which is the primary reason why there's a lot of issues with its citations of Old Testament scriptures. It's really citing the Septuagint, and not necessarily the Hebrew Old Testament. Most of the time, from what I can tell. And here's the most interesting part: Mark doesn't have a virgin birth story. Matthew does. Mark doesn't have a nativity. So Mark was more concerned with proving the point made in 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy is the first book in the entire New Testament to introduce Pontius Pilate to Jesus' life and Jesus' story.
And when's that book dated, the First Timothy?
Well, scholars actually, ironically, they put it either in the 90s or the 2nd century.
Mm-hmm.
Because it has a development of gnosis, the Greek word for knowledge. Mentioned in the text a few times. Like, okay, that's like the primary basis, but I go further than that. I say 1 Timothy was aware of Josephus, and the Gospel of Mark was primarily based on 1 Timothy, the Book of Hebrews, and the Septuagint, and Paul's epistles. Those are the primary sources that Mark used, and of course it uses Josephus Flavius to create its passion narrative. Let me look at a couple of questions real quick. Rasta Man says, what do you think of Russell American's idea then that the Septuagint is not actually a translation but a separate text compiled at the same time as the Hebrew Bible? That's ridiculous, because it's not like in the ancient world that we had printers and that we could translate something quickly from one language to another. It took a long time. So I'm convinced that the Septuagint had to be a later translation of the Old Testament, exactly as our ancient sources tells us. See, what American is doing is he's ignoring what our ancient sources are saying and claiming, well, they're wrong, because somehow he knows better than our ancient sources do, and he'll say that the Septuagint was written in parallel to the time the Old Testament was written in Hebrew.
Well, what's the historical position on the Septuagint? Because what I'm seeing is, what do they think? Okay, I can see the Septuagint being written during the Ptolemaic era, but do you believe that there was already a separate Torah written before that time?
Yes, it's involving the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis asserts that the Old Testament was written over a long period of time, compiled, written by many authors, that many authors wrote each book practically. Not necessarily many authors per book, but like, let me think of a good example. Take Genesis. Genesis isn't really one book, it's at least 2. Because we have 2 authors in chapter 1 of Genesis already. When we look at chapters 1 and 2. There's 2 creation stories. And it goes on, it starts switching from that, it goes from that there's actually more than one God into eventually compressing God down to one deity. And such a disagreement like that in the literature suggests that this was not written around the same time. You would have conflicts like that if that were the case. They're being stitched together by a later compiler. Or maybe the author of the second version of Genesis was the compiler. Probably most likely the case. And he compiled the older version of Genesis with his own. And you can't have such a situation happening during the 3rd century BCE when the Septuagint was getting written down. But you can have something like that if you're looking at the Babylonian captivity, which was a huge crisis for ancient Israel. And that's how the Tanakh was born. It was out of that captivity, which is the consensus view. And I agree with that. Because the Babylonians technically worshipped Marduk as the only god. Well, almost. I think their position was monolatry. That they primarily worshipped Marduk but didn't deny the existence of other gods. Looks like Kawami wants to join us.
Now, do you believe, okay, because this is, you should look into this. Like, I was reading the story of, because I have a Bible, one of the Bibles I use, it translates the name of God. So they'll say like Elohim, like it's not translating as God every other word for the names of God in the Bible. So we'll have Yahweh, Adonai, Elohim, Al Shaddai, like that. If you look at the story of Abraham, and he's about to sacrifice Isaac, it starts with Elohim tells him to go down and to sacrifice. And then at the point where he's about to knife him, Yahweh comes in the story and saves Isaac. And then they see the ram and everything else. And then further down in the story, is only Abraham comes down solo from the mountain. There's no Isaac. And then Sarah dies in the next chapter. But so when I read this, I'm like, did Abraham really kill Isaac? And according to Jewish Midrash, they do have Midrash that says that Isaac was killed. So there's two different versions of the story going on among the rabbis. So, and if you look into Isaac's story, it's just a rehash of Abraham. So that's why I think that there was different traditions going around that had to have a somewhat of a Torah, and that was, there's different, it seems like they had different stories for different characters in the Bible. And when it was finally written in the Torah, they had to do some redactions to make everything more smooth, and which is not smooth because you can see where they're doing the redactions if you look at the way they're using the names of God in the Bible. So, and I thought it was a crazy theory about this Isaac, but then I know there's a rabbi in New York who wrote a whole book on this and was presenting the Midrashic stories that, oh, Mount Moriah was the ashes of Isaac, and like they go really in deep into it. So I'm thinking that the Torah we have is not the Torah they had back then, because you have two Noah stories, two creation stories.
Oh yeah.
The Moses story seems like there could have been two different stories. This song at the sea, there's no Moses. There's only Aaron and Miriam. So I think that they had different. They're trying to put together different pieces of a story together, and then adding their own flavor to it. Like, it just doesn't seem like they had one Torah already completed before they went to Septuagint. Like, that's what I look at this text.
So Kwame is here. Kwame, do you want to say something? You're muted right now.
Yes, Jacob. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Same here. Is there something you want to talk about?
Yes, I wanted to ask you what you thought about the therapeutics. What I kept asking about that Philo spoke about, and Eusebius talk about them too. He identified the therapeutics as the early Christian monks. I wanted to know what you thought about that.
Well, it's possible because Philo believed in the Logos and the cult about surrounding the Logos was arguably an earlier form of Christianity before Jesus was even part of it. And Philo's family were vassals. They were Roman clients, very much like the Adiabeni were. And Philo's nephew was Tiberius Alexander. Tiberius Alexander actually crucified two sons of Judas the Galilean in AD 47, James and Simon. James and Simon are in Acts. Here I mentioned as both being brought before Agrippa. Although I suspect that their story was meant to substitute the death of James the Just. I think Professor Eisman discussed something similar.
I can't really hear you. Somebody background. I can't really hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Somebody background, like somebody's outside or something.
Well, give me 1 second. I think I can. Just give me 1 second. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so let me just get situated here again. Okay. So Tiberius Alexander actually joined Emperor Vespasian in his siege of Jerusalem. And later on, in another video that I'm going to be doing later, I'm going to demonstrate that Philo's family are in fact related to the royals of Adiabeni. And once all those links are firmly established, then people can understand that the Logos was preached in Adiabeni. And once you start linking Adiabeni to the biblical Bethany, you start linking Paul's Antioch to Edessa, because Edessa is essentially Adiabeni, then you start realizing that, okay, Paul's Jesus, as I've been saying for some time now, because Paul's Jesus, as far as I'm concerned, is the biblical Jesus. You look at the Gospels, you look at the Pauline pseudepigraphy, that's all nonsense. Focus on Paul's authentic letters.
If you could prove Philo is related to the Adiabeni, that would be like the smoking gun.
Yeah, it's actually hidden in plain sight. There's a name there that links them together. An unusual name, and I'll show that on the video that I'm going to be doing soon. Philo preached, as I've been saying before, a very strange form of Yahweh. The Logos is the flesh that Yahweh created, and the Logos is therefore the Son of Yahweh. But the Logos is not conscious. He's not conscious. So Yahweh inhabits his mind, his brain, and therefore the body of the Logos becomes conscious. So Yahweh's body is his own Son. It's how Philo believes when it comes to the Logos. It's kind of strange. It could give somebody a headache to try to understand what Philo is doing, but that's what Philo is doing. And Paul's understanding of Jesus is based on that concept. The Gospel of John's understanding of Jesus is also based on that concept too.
Yeah. One thing that you broke down greatly was Emperor Adrian reference to the Christians.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the Historia Augusta.
Because you, the way you broke it down, I had a whole new look on it. Like, because the way Adrian is explaining it, already people see that Christians already exist before Jesus, and the quote from Eusebius is talking about when he identified Philotherapeuts as the first Christian monks. That kind of like put the smoking gun, because it's like, how can Philo be talking about the Logos and not even talk about Jesus? And
Exactly.
there's no way Philo be talking about the same philosophy in the same way and not talk about or vice versa. So that
Right.
kind of is kind of strange, because Philo went to I think he did went to Jerusalem, if I'm not mistaken, but he never talked about any group of um pertaining to Jesus, like any Messiah, messianic
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's true. Um, yeah, Philo's family were definitely Hellenistic Jews. I'm not sure if they called themselves Christians, but they definitely did call themselves a cultus logos. That's how they would refer to their. That's how we understand what they would call themselves back then. From what I remember, they would start by calling their religions a cultus. I'm not positive about that though. Um, but yes, Hadrian's biography, although a late text, is aware of a tradition of a form of Christianity that predates the one Paul had preached. That is for sure. Now, once you get to the New Testament, the whole thing from start to finish, from First Corinthians to Revelation, you got Jesus being called the Lord from start to finish, as Margaret Barker has demonstrated. That the entire New Testament fails to call Jesus the Lord's Son. He is Lord, but he's called the Most High Son. That's because the Christians took a concept that predated the monotheistic reform in the 6th century BCE in ancient Judah, and in ancient Israel, and they took a crowbar and they separated the Most High and Yahweh back into two separate gods, exactly as it was originally done back in ancient Israel before they became monotheistic, before what you would call the uh, Deuteronomic reform. The Most High and Yahweh were originally two separate gods, but when the reform occurred, they became one God. But
so
the New Testament
you,
separated the two.
so you believe it was some form of Bible around the Babylonian captivity?
Yeah, the Old Testament.
What's your thought on Russell Gomurkin theory that the Septuagint was written around 270 BCE?
Well, as I said earlier, that doesn't explain what our sources tells us. All of our sources tell us that the Septuagint is a translation of the Torah into Greek, not written in parallel with the Torah at the same time. Uh, the other problem is you have to explain why there's evidence of multi-authorship in many of the Old Testament books, including the books like the Book of Genesis. In the Book of Genesis, there are two creation stories that could not have been written by the same author, because the author or authors of the Book of Genesis, when you read it from start to finish, it starts with polytheism and it ends with monotheism. And this tradition has to be compiled and harmonized, which would take much longer than 10 to 20 years to deal with, much less form a unified Old Testament before a translation could be done. You just can't do something like that in 10 to 20 years time. You got to have a lot more time than that. And
So you agree with the documentary hypothesis that
uh,
kind of like a gradual thing. Like
yeah.
they just picked up from different empires and just
hmm
assimilated it into Judaism and just Judified.
Yeah, starting with the Assyrian captivity and ending at the Babylonian captivity. By the time the Babylonian captivity occurred, um, uh, the Jews at that time created Judaism in order to harmonize divisions in theological thought, because they believed that their national God Yahweh, he was a national God at the time, as it says in the book of Deuteronomy, the Most High divided the nations of the world, and Yahweh was given Israel, and about 71 other gods received the other. There's like 70 to 72 nations, depending on the translation, and Yahweh was just one of these many sons of this Most High God, and he got Israel. So, what's interesting is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it still has that text in there. However, there was the Masoretic redaction of the Old Testament, a Masoretic redaction of the Old Testament. And in the Masoretic redaction, they took out the part where it said that the Most High divided the nations according to the number of the gods. And they replaced according to the number of gods with according to the children of Israel. According to the number of the children of Israel.
That makes sense.
They replaced that. Actually, I'll show an example. All right, let's look at the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible. This is from the Dead Sea Scrolls now. I'm going to read the Dead Sea Scrolls version of Deuteronomy. And then after I'm done with this, I'm going to have to go. But I'll read these so all of you can understand the exact differences. I just have to find it. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 to 9. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he separated humankind, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of God. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. Okay, that's the Dead Sea Scroll version. Now we're going to read the JPS Hebrew English Tanakh version that's representative of the Masoretic tradition.
The Masoretic, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to read that real quick. Here we are. When the Most High gave nations their homes, and he set the divisions of man, he fixed the boundaries of peoples in relation to Israel's numbers. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his own allotment. Or some texts or some translations put his inheritance, which is more correct. So you got the Dead Sea Scroll Bible and the Masoretic Bible and conflict around that verse, and that's because the Masoretes were concerned, the Masoretic Jews were concerned that this was polytheism that survived from the ancient period. So they wanted to scribble that out and replace it with children of Israel, so that way it would appear that God chose Israel for himself after he divided the other nations and gave them their own leaders. When in reality, God's Father gave the Lord Israel, gave Yahweh Israel.
I do have a final question before you go off.
Sure.
So when it comes to the Old Testament, and how many of those characters, the patriarchs and the prophets, how many of those people do you believe were actually existed, are not just later creations from the priests?
Well, as I'm gonna demonstrate later, the Old Testament patriarchs were actually the kings of Assyria.
Okay.
What were we about to say there?
I was going to say that when it came to Abraham, I don't believe he existed. Moses, I'm kind of shaky with Moses. I believe that I could see that there could have been some type of founder who developed like an initial founder, but what we have is not the full story. Right. I don't see. I honestly, I looked through Egyptian history. I looked through all the history, and I can't find a Solomon and a King David and the Queen of Sheba. I honestly can't find them in history.
Well, I'm not.
A lot of embellishments.
Yeah, I'm
No.
not really looking at Egypt. I'm looking at Syria. At
Hmm.
least they. I'm not saying that they are historical, but they got the names. They actually got much of the story from the Assyrian kings.
Yeah,
Because
and I personally wouldn't be surprised because I think the story of Solomon could have been another monarch that they developed their story and what they did. Because you see that, because I was looking at Jeroboam and the kings in the north of Israel,
yeah,
and they were very prosperous during their time, rather than when Judea was kind of like a small town, no, like a little tribal small confederacy. That Jerusalem wasn't that big of a city at the time,
right.
so I do see that the stories were embellished, but when it comes to the patriarchs, like Genesis, the Book of Genesis, I'm kind of leaning toward they could have been old. I think they're all kind of basically folk tales, but early oral traditions based on probably mythological characters. And then I believe Moses there could have been, to me, there could have been a Moses, and the Exodus could have been like 50 people walking out. I don't believe like 2 million Jews ran out of
Hmm.
it, you know?
Well, I don't really think there really was an Exodus. It's probably I think it's
Mm-hmm.
based on the Hyksos Exodus. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Moses is I think Moses is based on Pharaoh Kamudi of the Hyksos, the last
Okay.
pharaoh of the Hyksos.
Kamos,
Kamudi,
Kamos,
Kamudi, not Kamos.
Kamudi.
Hmm.
From my observation, it looked like Abraham was based on Idrahimi, the king of the Haberus, that came from Alaka, the northern kingdom around Turkey, around that Turkey Syria area. Because most of the Abraham stories constructed around Haran and Saint Lerfa and that whole area. It seemed from the evidence presented, it seemed like the Abraham story is based on the Idrahimi king of the Haberus. And
Because
I think Moses is probably more of an embellishment of the Asiatics leaving Egypt. That was under some form of Egyptian philosophy that was more opposed to the Asiatic philosophy. Like,
it's certainly possible. When you look at the Assyrian kings list, you're going to find that the second king of Assyria was called Adam, or Adama. You find a bunch of other kings there with similar names to the Old Testament patriarchs, like Solomon, who was what I got Salma, which is the Hebrew for Solomon. A bunch of
Oh, I need to look that up. I never really
and
looked.
to me, what gives it away is the Ezekiel 16:3 reference to when Yahweh is speaking to Israel and he says, "Hear unto Israel, your ancestors are the Hittites and the Amorites."
mhm.
So that basically just point them all the way up there. And another thing, Abraham could have never been from Iraq because he can't walk 700 miles from Iraq up to Haran and Turkey and then walk back down to Egypt. That wouldn't even make logical sense. So clearly, he came from Turkey, went down a couple miles to Haran, and went down into Syria and into the Levant. That's all I have to say. So,
Yeah, uh, it's possible. Well, alright, everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and head off. Thank you, Kawami and Victor for joining me tonight. Uh, and thank you to everyone else that has been watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And if any of you wish to support the channel more so, check out the Patreon and PayPal. Thank you for watching. I'll see all of you later.
it's a pleasure, Jacob.
Nice to see you.